Joining us today is Anthony Hickling, Executive Director of the Carbon Leadership Forum, a leading organization focused on reducing embodied carbon in the built environment. Anthony plays a pivotal role in shaping CLF's initiatives, ensuring that efforts to drive embodied carbon reductions are structured, resourced, and capable of creating impactful change. His passion for sustainable architecture fuels his mission to transform buildings from an environmental challenge into a cornerstone of climate solutions. Today, we'll explore Anthony's insights on embodied carbon, sustainable building practices, and the future of architecture in combating climate change. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Carbon Accounting and Management Podcast, presented by North Star Carbon Management. I'm your host, Chris Barsman. If you're a professional responsible for managing your organization's carbon footprint, this podcast is for you. We bring you expert insights, emerging technologies, and actionable strategies to excel in the complex world of carbon management. Stay tuned for an enlightening conversation and real-world solutions. Let's jump in. Thanks for joining us today. Our guest today is Anthony Hickling. Anthony, would you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you work, and the work that you do, please?
Yeah. Hi. So I am Anthony Hickling. I'm the Managing Director at the Carbon Leadership Forum. The Carbon Leadership Forum, maybe to step it back a second before even giving a full introduction to the work that we do. I think it's sometimes helpful for people to know that the building industry has a really huge impact when we're looking at global carbon emissions. So buildings, for example, are responsible for about 40% of total energy-related greenhouse gas emissions. And to add a little bit more of the kind of number side to that, over the next 40 years, globally, we're planning on building about a new New York City in terms of size every month or so. And during that time, the impacts that come from creating the materials that go into buildings and actually building buildings on the greenhouse gas side, it's expected to be about equal to the operational impacts of buildings. And so what we do at the Carbon Leadership Forum is focus on developing research and resources that help people understand the impacts related to the emissions for building materials and building construction practices, and then the ways that we can be reducing them.
Wow. Yeah, and that's, as you mentioned, super important right now. And I think you did a great job putting it into numbers, how large an impact that the buildings have. And I think we even think about this in terms of housing right now, and the number of units that we're short in the world and the U.S. in particular. And we want to address that. That's a human problem, but the same side is we have to address the carbon side of the equation as well. So I think that's the work that you folks do is incredible and really powerful and super important. So thank you very much for being with us today and kind of sharing some of that information. I think where maybe it might be a good place to kind of jump off into all of this is when we think about buildings. Obviously there's a lot of the direct impact, the energy that goes into building the building, but there's a lot of the scope 3. And so what's your perspective on how you might think about scope 3, how a builder might go about trying to conceptualize the scope 3 emissions and capturing what's important while not getting bogged down in all of the weeds and, really just, again, focusing on what matters?
Sure. Yeah. Well, maybe to provide some more context around scope 3 and the built environment. I think that one thing that's really helpful to know is that this is I'd say like a slice of the carbon pie that has been really neglected for a long time. So we talk about, for example, the CDP's reported that supply chain emissions for corporations are 11.4 times higher than a company's operational emissions on average. And there are places that are starting to require both disclosure and in some different instances, actual reductions in scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. And the work that we do is really focused on scope 3. And particularly it's focused on materials that go into buildings and the impacts related to the actual construction process of a building. So historically, when we look at the total impact of the built environment, and you talk about green buildings, we've spent a lot of time on improving the operations of our buildings. And so that means that we've been adding solar panels, we've been improving insulation. You've probably heard the term net zero building or maybe net zero ready building. And all of that is fantastic because, as I said at the beginning, buildings contribute a lot to global greenhouse gas emissions. But scope 3, which is like these purchased emissions that are associated with the materials that go into the buildings, has been really neglected from both an academic perspective as well as a practice perspective and policy. And so what we're working on doing is taking a look at, for a business that wants to understand all of its emission scopes, and in some places like California, that's going to be required really soon or already is. How do we understand scope 3? How does that relate to the built environment? And then what are the things that we can be doing to be reducing them? So I'm happy to go into a little bit more about what some of the strategies are and things like that. I'm not sure how deep to go right now. So you tell me.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think taking a step, like maybe a little step above it, and then you can kind of go into how it got developed. Your EC, I'm sorry, excuse me,
EC3.
the EC3 tool and the embedded carbons tool. I was looking on the website and just was like, wow, what powerful tool. And as I understand it, it's a free tool for companies to utilize. So can we understand a little bit more about what that tool does, how to best utilize it, and then maybe you can kind of dive into some of the methodology that was around the construction of it.
Sure. Yeah, I can start with the EC3 tool, and then I think I can even maybe back up and give a little bit of other context to the other ways that we can address embodied carbon outside of the scope of that tool. So EC3 stands for Embodied Carbon and Construction Calculator. And basically what EC3 does is it is a database of what are called environmental product declarations of common building materials. And so we oftentimes will compare environmental product declarations to nutrition labels on food, but they're kind of the nutrition label for carbon and other environmental impacts for building materials. And I'll say for a really long time before EC3 existed, the way that you would find an embodied carbon declaration, or an environmental product declaration is by requesting it from the manufacturer that you'd be purchasing materials from. And these are typically in PDF form. They're often formatted differently. The information is maybe shared in different units, things like that. And years ago, I was working at a general construction company where I was a sustainability intern, and I was collecting these EPDs to look at the carbon impacts of materials that we might be purchasing for projects. And it was the least favorite part of my job. It was really cumbersome to go through and try to find that information, make sure that you're comparing apples to apples, converting units, things like that. And so what EC3 does is it created this database for us to store environmental product declarations and then make the information much more easy to understand. It's digitized and it's also comparable. So now if you, for example, are looking at 3 different potential suppliers for steel that you're going to be purchasing on your project, or carpet tiles or insulation or whatever it might be, you can use EC3, plug in all of the different ones that you might be purchasing, and compare their embodied carbon impacts right there in the same place. And so the idea is that once you know what you're going to be putting into your building, you can include carbon as one of the decision-making criteria that's a part of your procurement process. I think the other thing that's helpful to think about for embodied carbon is that when you are buying materials, that's the last decision that you're making that has an impact on the total embodied carbon of your project. And so in addition to buying the best version of the steel that's spec'd for your building, we can be thinking much earlier about things like, does that building even need to be built, for example, right? Is there an existing building that could be retrofitted to serve the needs that you have right now for this new space? If so, that's a huge savings of embodied carbon because you're not pouring new concrete, you're not, at least the structural materials would likely stay. You might add some new ones, you might refinish it, et cetera. Then later on in the process, once you know what a building's going to look like, we can also be influencing the embodied carbon emissions by determining what that how that building is going to be designed. And so that's when we're saying, okay, it's going to be concrete, it's going to be steel, it's going to be mass timber. This is what the shape of the building is going to look like. And before we start using EC3, there are tools that help design professionals, that help engineers and architects, for example, start looking at what the design is and how you can be reducing the impacts at that stage of the project. Could you, change, like I said, change the shape of the building, use different materials. And then there are tools like Tally, for example, that help us project what the impacts would be as you plug and play with those decisions. There's other tools that people are using as well earlier on the design process. Epic, for example, is one that people like to use. It's developed by EHDD. There's another tool called CARE that looks at what the embodied carbon avoided might be if you retrofit an existing building instead of built a new one. So there's a lot of tools out there that we can use from the very beginning of the process when we're like, this is what we want to build, all the way through, this is the material that we're going to buy and install.
I realized that when we were talking about this, we've talked about embodied carbon, but we didn't actually fully define it for those in the group that may not fully understand it. So let's take one more step back and say, let's talk about embodied carbon. What is it? Why is it important? And I think we've kind of covered a lot of the other stuff, but let's cover the 101 real quick.
Sure, yeah, the 101 for embodied carbon. So basically, embodied carbon relates to all of the emissions that are associated with manufacturing materials and getting them to where they might be installed, as well as disposing of them or taking care of them in some way or another at the end of their life. And so if we were to think about, let's say, some kind of, nature-based insulation, right? Maybe it's straw bales. So there's some folks right now who are looking at using straw bales as this alternative to existing, styrofoams and things like that. If we were to look at the embodied carbon of straw bales or styrofoam, we would look at how it's produced, right? So what are the impacts associated with mining for that material or growing that material? What are the emissions that are associated with that machinery, et cetera? Then we follow the material to production, where it's, turned into something that's actually usable. It's converted from some kind of raw material into some actual product. That generates a lot of emissions. Then it gets transported to a job site where it's then installed. There might be a lot of emissions installing that product. And then it sits there for hopefully as long as possible as a building material. And then ultimately, it's often thrown away, or maybe it's burned or sent to landfill. And so the embodied carbon relates to all of those emissions. And it's particularly significant for materials like concrete or steel because they require really high temperatures to produce those materials in the manufacturing stage. And for concrete, at least, there's also process emissions, which means that, regardless of the high temperatures that you need to get to actually produce cement, the process of heating it at all and separating the chemical elements releases CO2 into the atmosphere. And so what we're looking at is how can we be using less energy? How can we be incentivizing the incorporation of lower carbon materials in buildings? And that really can be done in a lot of different ways.
That's awesome. No, that's a great overview and a great way to conceptualize it. And I think, we, in some of our other discussions I've had with folks, we've talked a lot about spend-based and how a lot of companies are trying to utilize spend-based to try to, capture their scope 3. And so I really love how this embodied carbon is just showing the other way that it can be, the other approach that can be taken to be a little bit more exact, to be a little bit more particular, which can then inform purchase decisions, product decisions, and more actionable versus a spend-based technique, which the only way you can reduce carbon on a spend-based technique is to spend less. And so, that's I just love the how this can really for those that are on a spend-based technique can start to think about alternatives to building out their inventories.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that for that spend-based approach, embodied carbon of building materials, I think, is one of the really good examples of why that doesn't work. Because, for example, you could be disincentivized to be spending any kind of cost premium for a greener material if your scope 3 accounting method is spend-based, right? Like, say the greener cement or concrete that you're using has a 1% premium. Well, now your scope 3 emissions look like they just went up 1%, but maybe that concrete is 50% better than the alternative. And so this just kind of highlights the need to get a little bit more specific when we're looking at the cost and how that relates to the carbon emissions for building materials.
That's a really good point, and I appreciate you pointing that out for the listeners. And so it sounds to me that, with that, how important it is that the planning process is executed well, and making sure that end use of the building is considered, how, to your point, using an existing building versus starting from scratch, what that really looks like. Have you worked with groups that have successfully integrated stakeholders, and what does that process look like, to really make sure that when you're starting at that design planning phase, you're actually capturing all the information that you need? What are some of those key points or key stakeholders that you think you would recommend folks to kind of consider?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that everybody has a role to play in the process. So at the very beginning, we're looking at building owners and developers, and they're the ones who are going to determine, where the project's located, how big it's going to be, what are the requirements for that specific project. And they can have embodied carbon in mind and include that as criteria for what a successful project looks like. And there's organizations like the Urban Land Institute, for example, that works with owners and developers to help them kind of evaluate the impacts of their portfolios and look at opportunities to reducing embodied carbon from their perspective. Then we've got, once we know what building is going to be built, those developers and owners are working with the engineers, they're working with the architects, ultimately they're working with the contractors, who all can play a different role as well. So for example, the engineers, like I said, kind of have a role to play in what the structure looks like. The architects kind of iterate on that. Both of them have tools that they can be using. Tally was one of the ones that I was mentioning, Epic, Care, others. And then later on is when contractors typically would be using the EC3 tool. And so I think that one thing that's really important is that early on, it needs to be clear that reducing embodied carbon and holding that as a priority throughout the project is a priority. And that's, I think, really kind of going to boil down to what the owner wants. And then from there, everybody else can follow suit. And if it's not a priority from the very beginning, then everybody else hopefully is going to still find ways to kind of, piece it in where it makes sense and where it doesn't change the scope of the project.
Yeah, that makes sense. As I'm thinking about coming back to the EC3 tool, when we're thinking about those product labels, as you're saying, how do we know that what's being reported is right? How do we know the efficacy of this information, and what are some approaches that companies can use to kind of ensure that this is right, that the data is meaningful?
Yeah, it's a good question. So environmental product declarations are third-party verified, and there are systems in place to determine how they are developed. And so even before an environmental product declaration exists, they're governed by what are called product category rule committees. And a product category rule committee is the place where you determine the rules for comparability across materials. So, for example, it would make sense to compare certain types of structural steel against each other, but it wouldn't necessarily make sense to have the same kind of data reporting process and scopes included for carpet tiles. And so there are these agreed upon rules within PCRs. After that, we have third-party verified environmental product declarations, or EPDs. And I think that right now we can trust EPDs as a place to be able to to estimate the impacts of the materials that we're purchasing, they have different levels of specificity within EPDs. So sometimes you could have a industry average EPD, which basically says, the industry average for this kind of material is X. But then other EPDs are more specific. They might be facility specific EPDs where it says from this specific facility, we know that these were the energy inputs and we know what the total carbon emissions were. So I would say that right now, you want to make sure that you're comparing like materials, and you want to make sure that you understand the scope that's included within the EPD. But where EPDs are available, they're a really good tool to help people make those decisions.
Well, that's great to know. I mean, that's again such a powerful thing to be able to understand and have that as a tool in the belt to be able when you're starting to make decisions.
Sure.
As I'm thinking about this more, I'm just curious if you have any examples that if you're allowed to share, where potentially maybe an organization was able to look at these EPDs and say, we wanted this, but we got this, and here were some of the positive outcomes of making that decision, not just potentially on the carbon side, but maybe it was like a cost side, an efficiency side. Do you have any specific examples or anything like that you might be able to share?
I can share that it's happening all the time. I can't, I don't know of a report right now that necessarily compiles case studies, for example, of GCs looking at EPDs and making reductions because of that. But, that is maybe more implicit in the growth of availability of EPDs and the growth in the kind of user base of EC3, for example. So I don't know what the number is right now. Last time I checked, it was in the 30,000 range of users for EC3. I'm sure it's much higher than that at this point. There are many people who are using this tool regularly as a procurement decision-making kind of tool to be able to source lower carbon materials. And yeah, I think that there's examples. I'm not sure if there's a place that consolidates them necessarily right now.
Yeah, no problem. What is the role that you think policy is playing in the use of these kind of tools? Obviously, the California law is something that everybody's talking about, and when we're talking construction, it's probably going to touch a lot of the downstream suppliers, not just the huge builders, but also their subcontractors. How have you seen the policy start to have those kind of impacts, and where do you think it'll have the most positive impact?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that over the years there have been some leading private groups that have focused on this voluntarily, and they've kind of shown that it's possible and that reductions can be made. And personally, I think that needs to be complemented by policy to make sure that emissions reductions are scaling. And that's really starting to happen. So you mentioned California. There's a couple pieces of legislation or programs, maybe more broadly, that have been introduced and or are being implemented in California that have had a big impact, both to kind of prove the concept of reducing embodied carbon as a policy mechanism or through policy mechanisms, as well as a way to drive big reductions. So, for example, in California, in 2017, they passed Buy Clean, and Buy Clean is a policy that basically requires the disclosure of environmental product declarations of certain commonly used construction materials for public projects, and then ultimately that will help inform a baseline that gets set for those materials. And then over time, reductions are going to be required. And so in California now, that program has been implemented. They're collecting the data. They're requiring the data meets this kind of average that's been set as their benchmark. Another example is that in California recently passed the Cal Green Code, which is a different approach. It doesn't just apply to public projects. Now it applies to all projects, I believe, over 100,000 square feet and maybe over 50,000 square feet for educational facilities, if I'm remembering correctly. And there's a few different mechanisms to comply to that policy. So if I'm remembering correctly, I think there's a material approach that kind of looks at EPD disclosure. There's a whole building lifecycle analysis approach that's looking at how you are designing the building and showing that you reduce the projected impact of the embodied carbon in the final building design. And again, this is all off the top of my head. I think that the last piece is looking at building retrofits as a way to comply with the policy, or renovations instead of, like I was saying, demolishing something and building new.
Hi, listeners. Quick interlude here just to clarify a couple things about the California Green Code, or Cal Green Code. First off, it applies to all newly constructed residential buildings and to any additions or alteration that increases a building's conditioned area, interior volume, or size. Basically, anywhere that offers sleeping accommodations is covered within this code. Furthermore, there are three main ways that developers can comply with the code: through building reuse, by performing a whole building life cycle assessment, or WBLCA, or by using environmental product declarations, or EPDs. Okay, just wanted to clarify those points. Back to the conversation.
So those are a couple of examples out of California right now. There's a bunch of other work happening in other states, as well as at the federal level. And typically right now it's material specific. So they're looking at setting baselines and requiring reductions over time for materials that are used in publicly procured projects. And that has a really big impact. So when we look, for example, at concrete and steel, together globally, those materials contribute about 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. In the US, as a purchaser of materials, public procurement's responsible for about half of all cement CO2 emissions and about 18% of steel emissions. And so this kind of policy where we say that, disclosure and then ultimate reductions over time for materials used in public projects can have a huge influence on driving demand for lower carbon materials.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it seems like to your point, it's kind of proving the concept of this could be done, and kind of being able to pull the market in a particular direction. So that just makes sense for those in the private space to kind of follow suit. And I imagine that it also, even the marketing benefits that can come from as you start doing these things and start realizing your reduction targets. So yeah, that sounds great. One other quick question, and then we'll kind of get into our wrap-ups. In terms of total impact, I know we've talked about steel, we talked about concrete. Is there anything like if a builder is just barely getting into this thought process, and you were to point them in the direction of one area that they could have the most impact first, like here's the first thing you really should start looking at, which of the materials would it be?
I think it depends on your region. So in some areas, environmental product declarations are abundant and accessible, and in other areas, they aren't so much. And so I think that it's clear to everybody that structural materials play a huge role. I think that realistically, it makes sense to start where you can find the data. And so if you are a contractor and there are available EPDs in your area for some of the structural materials that are going into your building, those have a huge impact on global climate emissions and are important to look at. But there's a lot of additional impacts that come from even retrofitting spaces, refinishing, and there's data on those interiors materials as well. There's emerging data on mechanical, electric, and plumbing equipment. So I think that depending on who you are, just asking for this data is a really great starting point. And if it doesn't exist already, it serves as a demand signal to the market that this is something that you care about and that suppliers should be working on making accessible if they haven't already. And there are plenty of examples of that happening. I was just looking at an email a couple of weeks ago from a very large architecture firm who forwarded some correspondence with a material supplier who said, a couple of years ago when you were asking us about our environmental product declarations, they didn't exist. And, because you all were asking about it, we worked on making sure that we were able to share that data. And, here's the EPDs that you can use when you're working on developing your projects. And so I think that starting with wherever you can find data and asking for wherever it's missing is a really important step. And starting with structural materials is an easy way to kind of look at the really big impacts, but the other materials play a big role as well.
Awesome. And that's a great point to point out. And I think that ties nicely into kind of our final question. So here's where we'll jump in. I'll hit you with a few quick questions, asking about resources for our listeners. And so you can just kind of touch on a few of your favorites. So first one, are there any newsletters, websites, online resources, professional organizations that you'd really recommend for folks in your industry to consider following and paying attention to?
Definitely. So, at the Carbon Leadership Forum, we really want to make sure that people are making use of the work that we're doing and are engaging in whatever way is relevant for them. So we've got at our website, carbonleadershipforum.org, a newsletter that you can sign up for. We have local hubs where people are focusing on embodied carbon in their local regions that you can join through the Carbon Leadership Forum website. There's an online community and lots of resources there as well. So we've got toolkits for architects and developers and policymakers, and reports that help contextualize the current LCA or life cycle analysis data ecosystem, and lots of other things that can help start your kind of journey of learning about embodied carbon, as well as pursue the 201, the 301 levels of information that help kind of take the next step.
Awesome. That's a good one. I just want to reiterate that. I mean, you guys put out some great information, and it's, I know we've learned a lot through going and listening to the work that you folks do. So, what about conferences? Do you know any good conferences, any good that you'd recommend folks to check out?
Sure. Yeah. This year we're, I'm not sure if we're co-hosting or if we're supporting as a partner, but we're going to be participating in the Getting to Zero Forum that is put together by the New Buildings Institute. And there's going to be a big focus on embodied carbon at that conference this year. So I think that that's a good one to take a look at.
Do you know when that is and where it is by any chance off the top of your head?
North Carolina, May 21st to 23rd.
Perfect. Thank you. Have you ever found a surprising or unconventional source for data that you utilize in carbon accounting, or maybe the most useful data sources? You folks are a huge source of data, so but when you're aggregating it, has anything surprised you?
I think that our researchers are often, more surprised by the data than I am. They're the ones who are analyzing it and looking at it. But I will say, just in terms of sources of data, we really, in the past and currently, rely on firms who collect data and are willing to share it with us, right? That puts us in a position to be able to analyze the state of the market and look for trends for ways that we can be reducing embodied carbon emissions at scale. So I would just encourage organizations who are tracking this data to be a part of making sure that it's usable and accessible, and that organizations like the Carbon Leadership Forum can anonymize it in a way that you're comfortable with, while also making sure that the findings that have come out of your organization are combined with the findings of others, and that all of us together can be working on embodied carbon reductions.
Have you ever heard of any fun, interesting, and inventive ways that an organization has engaged their stakeholders to kind of all push in the same direction towards a lower carbon project or whatever it might be?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's useful is first just really being clear about there being a goal to reduce embodied carbon, or to address it in one way or another, maybe even to just track it. And I've heard of some firms that internally, for example, are being a little bit competitive about who can achieve the most significant reductions on their project and who can be most creative about that. I'm not sure about how institutionalized those competitions are, or if it's more kind of on a micro level between different designers. But I think that competition, or at least friendly competition, is healthy for organizations once everybody is aligned on what the goals are.
Yeah, that's great. That is a fun way to always get, when you start getting people competitive. It's funny the outcomes that you'll find.
Totally.
Now, as we just kind of get to the last question, if there's just one thing our guests take away from this conversation, what do you think it should be?
Talk about embodied carbon. I think that everybody has a different role to play. If you're a public company or a small company, or if you're a contractor or an architect, this has an impact on many different levels of your total carbon emissions within the scope that you control. And it's really important that everybody is both aware of this impact, but then also asking for decision makers to be playing a role in reducing embodied carbon. So talk about it, ask for environmental product declarations, ask your designers what their plans are to incorporate embodied carbon reductions in their designs. And I think that right now that's really what we need, is to make sure that this is scaling as a regular approach to how we design and build.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great one. And last question. I know we talked about it, but I just want to hit it one last time at the very end. Where can our listeners go to find out more about you, the work that you're doing, as well as the organization and the work that your organization is doing?
Yeah, take a look at the just carbonleadershipforum.org. That's probably the best place to sign up for our newsletter, learn about regional hubs, and access all levels of resources that might be able to help you in your journey of working on embodied carbon reductions.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. This is a great conversation. Anthony Hickling with the Carbon Leadership Forum. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for being our guest today.
Thank you. I really appreciate the time.
This brings us to the end of another lightning episode here at the Carbon Accounting and Management Podcast. We hope you found today's discussion insightful and that you're walking away with new ideas and actionable strategies. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or colleague, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on our latest episode. We also encourage you to join the conversation by rating this episode and sharing your comments and ideas with our community. If you have questions or topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes, we encourage you to email us at podcast@northstarcarbon.com. On behalf of myself, your host, Chris Barsman, and the entire North Star Carbon Management team, thank you for investing your time with us today. Until next time.